Hey everybody, we're back after a really long hiatus, aka COVID, but we're back with a new episode of the RevGENReply. And this week what we want to talk about is, now that COVID kind of seems like things are, I'm not going to say coming to a close, but as more and more people get vaccinated, we want to talk through what the recovery has looked like as we've gotten into 2021. So I've got Bill here with me, and we're just going to talk about recovery by hotel class, by star rating, the different kinds of products and how they recovered, as well as some of the geography as well that's involved with that. So let's start with just the topic, what has the recovery looked like? So let's talk by hotel class. So I've seen some industry data that seems to indicate that resorts have actually come back the strongest post-COVID. And then the other side of that spectrum would be convention hotels have actually fared the worst. So Bill, I'll kind of turn it over to you. Does that line up with kind of what you're seeing out there in the revenue management world?
Yeah, and I don't think that's necessarily going to shock anybody. It's pretty obvious stuff. The leisure beach destination, drive-to destinations hung in there the best through COVID. But what I do think is somewhat shocking is those leisure destinations are actually showing growth over 2019 numbers.
Yes.
And I don't know if anyone would have anticipated that happening this quickly.
Yeah.
The other, so they, some of the data that we've pulled together internally and also looking at the industry, after the leisure destination, which is kind of the obvious thing to come back, the second I thought was actually kind of surprising, and it was airport.
Yep.
There was a pretty significant gap though between like anything leisure driven, and then a big gap, and airport is still significantly down to 2019.
Exactly.
But I guess that just goes hand in hand with people getting vaccinated, feeling comfortable, and then probably a lot of leisure, pent up vacations, airport stays.
Yeah, and speaking of pent up demand, the way that the recovery curve has looked to me is we got into 2021 and there was still a lot of uncertainty in January and February. So neither of those 2 months really predicted what we would then go on to see in March and April. So as soon as we got to the month of March, and this is irrespective of like what type of hotel it was, there was a really, really big return to travel in March. And I think that this was really interesting because I noticed that the return to travel, it was for all days of week. So people just wanted to get out of the house. They didn't care what day of week that they stayed. So we saw lots of staycations that were even over weekdays where you normally wouldn't see that typical staycation, Friday, Saturday, Sunday stay. We had Smurf business that was staying across Sunday through Thursday, which was abnormal. But the interesting thing is none of it was corporate. And I really do think that people were just so excited to get out and travel that March ended up being a really, really strong month for some properties.
Spring break.
And spring break.
Spring
exactly.
break. Woo!
Yeah. So I had a hotel in a suburban market that ran 97% occupancy in the month of March, which was just absolutely crazy. But of course, the ADR bit and the rate bit hadn't really come back at that point. April was also very similar. So I had a lot of hotels that had a similarly strong April. Wasn't quite as strong as March, but I do think that there was a lot of enthusiasm to just get out of the house in March and April. And now that we get into May, things are still looking relatively strong, but I do think, we're right up against the cusp of summer. So I think that the summer is going to look awesome in 2021 for leisure travel. But there has been a little bit of a slowdown because a lot of the schools aren't out yet. So is that a fair assessment, Bill?
Yeah, I think that's fair. We'll get into business a little bit later, but the next big chunk segment that after your leisure / resort, then was your airport. Again, big gap there. The next big grouping that we saw was downtown. So interestingly enough, it looked like airport was doing a little bit better than downtown hotels. I think it's safe to say like most of the major metros were pretty ravaged by COVID, I guess.
Yeah,
and so people kind of stayed away from downtown. It's starting to come back now. But also I think a lot of downtown is driven by heavy midweek corporate and also big corporate groups. And obviously those market segments are going to come back later. And then this is no surprise, but out of those four major groups, the one that was lagging the most is conventions.
Yep. And convention, I have a convention hotel, so I can definitely speak to this. Just the convention calendar was obviously completely wiped out. So from the last 2 weeks in March of 2020, all the way until I would say Q1 2021, there really was nothing on virtually any convention calendar across the country. The conventions haven't really started to come back until now, essentially, like spring of 2021. And convention calendars are coming back, but we're still kind of lacking that complimentary white collar, weekday warrior kind of business traveler. So we just don't have that segment back yet. So the people who are traveling for conventions, it's very pared down. It's basically like minimum attendance basically for a lot of these conventions. So we're still lacking, I would say if there's any one big segment that's lacking right now, it's that higher ADR, white collar, transient business traveler.
Yep.
Yeah.
So what segments have weathered the storm the best? Not in terms of hotel scales, but market segments, customer segments.
Customer segments, I would say essential travelers are like one of the big ones. So for example, like projects, if there are any like infrastructure projects or something like that. Another really big one for several hotels was actually medical. So like traveling nurses has been big for a lot of hotels, just because that kind of fits in with that extended stay segment anyway. But I would say essential travel, and then like essential medical travel especially, and then infrastructure projects that just couldn't be paused during COVID.
All right, and then in terms of hotel scales or star ratings, I guess, that have recovered the best, I don't think this is any shock, but the economy segment and the extended stay segment.
Yeah. So economy and extended stay fared the storm the best, and that's during COVID. And then even coming out of COVID, they still have that more stable Sunday through Thursday stay, which again, most of like the middle of the pack hotels, 2 to 4 star rating, they really thrived on that white collar corporate travel that I talked about earlier. And the extended stay, they don't really have that problem as much. They're a little bit more insulated because they have that Sunday through Thursday base typically already built with the extended stay segment. But as we get out of COVID, there are 2 segments that are doing well right now, I would say. And it's still that low end, so more the economy scale, and then the luxury are starting to, like we talked about earlier with the resorts, those are starting to do better. So I would say the hotels that are really kind of missing out would be those middle of the pack hotels that really are set up to capture the white collar corporate travel.
All right, so I also think it'd be interesting to talk about not just recovery in general, but the real question mark still in the hotel industry is when is business travel going to come back? And you hear wildly differing opinions, and I think it's changed so much already. I mean, I think like last year when we were in the thick of COVID, Bill Gates, who he came out and said business travel will be down 50% indefinitely. And then you've got like today, basically, May 2021, you've got Barry Diller, chairman of Expedia, calling people dopes for saying that corporate travel is not coming back. Another interesting, business leader, Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase, he had some really interesting things to say last month. Basically, talked about conference call fatigue, talked about how, people needed to get back into the office, and he expected at least 50% of his workforce to get to come through. And what I think is the absolute most important thing for hotels, and this was really great for him to say, was he said that his company lost out on business to competitors. And when he asked those competitors why they lost out on that business, they said it was because the competitors traveled and visited them, and JP Morgan did not. And I think that sends a really strong signal to basically the entire economy that, in-person communication still matters. So, in my opinion, I think we're still not even really seeing a significant number of corporate bookings.
Yeah.
But I do think that booking window is going to be extremely tight. And I think coming out of the summer, heading into Q4, we might see slight spikes in pre-COVID levels. So like just how you talked about with leisure, when we had that pent-up demand of leisure in March and April of 2021, I think like September and October is going to be the pent-up corporate travel demand when all the business leaders tell their sales forces like, you haven't seen your client in 2 years, you got to hit the road.
Yeah.
And so we're going to see this huge spike, and then it's going to taper off through the holidays as it typically does. And then it's probably going to plateau a little bit in spring 2022. I don't think it's going to be back to pre-COVID levels because I do think that the economy has changed a little bit, and even though it's going to be extremely important that there's client-facing travel and getting deals done and essential travel, if you will, that's going to be really robust. But hey, I work out of our Chicago office and I haven't seen my coworker in New York in a while. Like that travel is going to take a long time to come back. And I think that's where Bill Gates is right. A meeting like that doesn't require a flight. That could be a quick Zoom, but
The externally facing
the external
client,
is going to be really strong because of the pent-up demand.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So to Bill's point, I think that geography may play into that a little bit as well because different markets see better convention travel. But I think what Bill's saying is we could see that as early as like September and October, which those are typically months where convention calendars are strong. So I think that there's going to be a lot of corporate travel in that, late Q3, early Q4, where we're probably going to have both pieces, right? So we'll have the convention piece, but then that's probably when we're going to see the first of those white collar transient business days kind of overlapping that. So we saw
football too.
And football, so it's kind of like a perfect storm. And typically October is a really, really good month for a lot of markets. Yeah. So I think October is probably going to be that first month where that's probably our best chance to see another 2019 or pre-COVID month. Market segment-wise, it's probably our next best chance, I think.
Yeah. So you mentioned conventions, they'll come back a little bit, but I don't know, just based on the way we've been seeing convention calendars come back, in big towns like San Francisco, it still doesn't really look like it's going to be back full force until mid to late 2022 at best.
Yeah, nationwide for things to be normal, probably mid 2022. Really, the only places that have a major advantage on the volume of conventions would just be the states that are most lax with their COVID restrictions. So until things are normal nationwide, yeah, probably 2022.
Yeah. All right. So this is RevGENReply. So there is one thing that I also need to reply.
Let's hear it.
Yeah. I referred to Barry Diller in an earlier RevGENReply talking about people saying business travel is not coming back. They're a bunch of dopes. But there's another thing Barry Diller said that was kind of interesting. He came out pretty strong against Apple and basically saying that Apple's devised a platform where it's a pay-to-play and they charge upwards of 30% for your app revenue, and he said it was egregious and even hinted at it being illegal. So what I find humorous about that is Barry Diller is the chairman of Expedia, and as much as I love Expedia, they drive a lot of business to hotels. He's basically knocking a very similar model to what he has running himself at Expedia. I mean,
exactly.
The Expedia margins at any hotel are anywhere from 15 to 20%, and then you've got to tack on your travel ads. credit card fees, cancellations, etc. I mean, you're talking 25-30% commission. So I highly doubt Barry Diller's watching this video, but if he is, I would be I could just say, hey, I'd love to hear a reply on how Expedia is vastly different than the Apple model that you attacked so
Shots fired.
so heavily. Yeah, take that, Barry. Let's go.
Nice. And we'll link the article so you can read it as well below in the description.